Step out of the vehicle. Now, before I decide this gets a lot worse for you. The words hang in the January air, flat and cold, shaped not as a question, but as a sentence already delivered. The man who says them stands at the driver's side window of a dark green sedan, one hand resting on the roof of the car, the other loose near his belt. His name is Drew Calloway. He has been a patrol officer in Carver Falls, Georgia, for 10 years. And in 10 years, he has learned one thing with particular confidence. Most people, when told to step out of a vehicle in the dark, will step out. The woman behind the wheel does not move immediately, not because she is afraid, because she is reading. Her eyes track across a small laminated card clipped to the visor, the vehicle registration, which she placed there herself when she bought the car, because she knew, the way certain people learn to know things, that she would need it quickly one day. She reads it through once, then she sets both hands on the steering wheel where they are visible. Only then does she open the door. Her name is Simone Graves. She is 47 years old. She is wearing a gray wool coat over a plain blouse, flat shoes, no jewelry except small studs at her ears. There is nothing about her in this moment that would tell you anything you do not already see. That is, in its own way, entirely the point. The night is quiet. Carver Falls quiets early in January, the kind of town where most of the lights on residential streets are off by 9 p.m. It is 11:42 p.m. Simone had been at the home of her neighbor, Margaret Elford, 73 years old, whose hip replacement had left her unable to reach her own kitchen cabinets for 3 weeks. Simone had brought soup in a sealed container, stayed for 2 hours, and left through the front door at 11:27 p.m. She knows the exact time because she checked her watch at the threshold, the way she checks everything at thresholds. The stop began 6 blocks from Margaret Elford's house. No warning, no visible equipment malfunction on the sedan. No rolling stop, no expired tag, no reason that Calloway would later be able to name with specificity. He had pulled up behind her at a red light, followed her for 4 blocks, then activated his lights. If this story already has your attention, a like and subscribe takes 2 seconds, and you will not want to miss where this one ends. The dispatch recording from 11:39 p.m. that night, Carver Falls County, Dispatch ID CF 2401-0178, logged by operator Vonda Trice, would later become one of the more significant pieces of documentation in this case. In it, Calloway's voice comes through clearly. He has run the plate. Dispatch confirms, in the flat professional tone of someone reading from a screen, that the vehicle is registered to a Simone A. Graves, no warrants, no flags, registration current through the following November. Calloway acknowledges. Then he gets out of his cruiser anyway. Simone hears none of this in real time. What she hears is the crunch of boots on cold asphalt and a flashlight beam that sweeps across her passenger seat before he reaches her window. License and registration. She hands both through the window before he finishes the sentence. He takes them without looking at her face. He looks at the license. He looks at the registration. He looks at the car, the interior of it, the back seat, the floor. Then he looks at her, and something shifts in his expression. Not recognition exactly, more like a conclusion reached faster than the evidence warrants. Where are you coming from? A neighbor's home on Aldine Street. At this hour. It is not a question. The way he says it makes it something else entirely. A judgment dressed in the shape of a question. The kind that invites you to defend yourself even when you have done nothing requiring defense. Simone does not answer it. She says instead, "Is there a traffic violation you'd like to address?" Calloway's jaw tightens. He steps back from the window. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." "Am I being detained?" "Step out, now." She steps out. She keeps her hands where they are visible. She has been doing that since before she opened the door. A habit worn so smooth it no longer requires thought. Just the way some people automatically check a stove before leaving a house. Both hands open at her sides. What follows takes 11 minutes. Calloway asks her to open the trunk. She asks whether he has a warrant or her consent. He tells her he does not need either. She tells him, quietly, citing the language from the posted ordinance she had read on the city's public notice board 2 weeks prior, that under OCGA Section 17-5-30, a warrantless search requires either consent, exigent circumstances, or a lawful arrest. She is not giving consent. She does not see exigent circumstances. She is not yet under arrest. Calloway stares at her for a long moment. The flashlight holds steady on her face. She does not blink away from it. Then he tells her she is obstructing. He reaches for his cuffs. Simone does not resist. She turns, puts her wrist behind her, and as the metal closes, she says, very clearly, to the cold air and the darkness in the dashcam mounted on Calloway's windshield, "I am not resisting. My name is Simone Graves. The time is 11:52 p.m. I am being handcuffed without stated cause." Calloway says nothing. He walks her to the back of the cruiser, opens the door, guides her in without force. Before he closes the door, she says one more thing. "I'd like to document the procedure being used here." He closes the door. She sits in the back of the patrol car with her hands behind her and her eyes straight ahead. And in the small space of her coat pocket, pressed against her left thigh, a recording application on her phone, started automatically when she stepped onto public ground outside Margaret Elford's front door, because she had made a habit of that too, continues running. The cruiser begins to move. The green sedan is left on the shoulder of the road, its emergency lights still blinking in the dark. Simone watches it through the rear window until a curve takes it out of sight. She does not know yet what is coming. She knows what is here. Carver Falls, Georgia is the kind of town that appears briefly in state tourism materials under the heading Historic Charm, and then is not mentioned again. Population 34,000, down from 39,000 at the last census before that. A main street with a hardware store, a pharmacy, 3 restaurants that rotate ownership every few years, and a courthouse built in 1922 that has not been significantly renovated since. The police department operates 12 patrol officers across 3 shifts. For complaints about officer conduct, residents file with the county-level Internal Affairs Unit, which handles grievances from 4 municipal departments and is perpetually behind on its caseload. Simone Graves had lived on Pemberton Road for 9 years. She had bought the house, 3 bedrooms, a porch with a cracked rail she kept meaning to fix, with cash, which she mentioned to no one, and which the county assessor's office recorded without ceremony. Her neighbors knew her as a quiet woman who kept her yard neat, brought food to people recovering from illness or surgery, and occasionally nodded hello from her car. She did not explain herself much. In a town where people explain themselves constantly as a form of social currency, this was noticed, but most people decided it meant she was simply private, which was acceptable enough. She worked from home, something to do with consulting, people assumed. She received mail from state offices occasionally, unremarkable government envelopes, and once a package that required a signature, which her neighbor Harold Finch signed for because she was away that day. He did not look at the return address for long. He left it on her porch and forgot about it by dinner. What people remembered when they thought about it later was small things. The way she always paused at the entrance of any building with posted hours or notices, reading them in full before going in. Not quickly the way most people glance, actually reading, running her eyes across each line. Sometimes her lips moved slightly. Harold had do it at the post office once and thought she was waiting for someone, before he realized she was reading the notice about certified mail fees posted at eye level on the doorframe. Her mornings had a particular order. Coffee first, then the news on the radio, not television, radio, then a walk around the block she took at the same pace regardless of weather, carrying nothing except her phone and a small spiral notebook she kept in her coat pocket. She wrote in it sometimes while walking, which looked strange to people who noticed, but most did not notice. Most people in Carver Falls are looking at their own feet in January. The notebook was a thing she had carried in some form or another for the better part of 20 years. Not a diary, not a journal in the emotional sense, more like a running record. Dates, observations, exact words she wanted to preserve before they could be softened by time or reframed by other people's accounts. She had filled 17 of them. She kept them in a box in her hall closet behind the winter coats, organized by year, each one labeled in her handwriting on a strip of white tape pressed to the spine. In the weeks before the stop, she had been doing something that was unremarkable on its face, reviewing the city's public record board online, looking at posted notices about traffic ordinance updates, reading the county ordinance regarding vehicle stops and consent requirements, taking notes in that current notebook. She had not told anyone why. There had been no specific precipitating event. She had simply started doing it, with the focused and systematic quality of someone who has decided to understand the terrain before they need to navigate it at speed. On a Tuesday morning in December, 3 weeks before the stop, Calloway had driven past her on Pemberton Road. He had been eating something from a paper wrapper and ran a stop sign at the end of her block. She had been on her porch. She watched his cruiser move through the intersection without slowing. He did not look at her. She was nobody in his field of vision. That was December. This was January, and the arithmetic of that difference would take months to fully resolve. The morning after the stop, Simone was released from the Carver Falls Municipal Holding Facility at 7:15 a.m. No charges were filed. The official documentation listed the basis for detention as failure to comply with lawful officer instruction, a phrase with enough procedural flexibility to cover a great deal without specifying much. Her car had been left on the shoulder overnight and towed at the department's direction to an impound lot on the other side of town, because Calloway had noted in his supplemental log that the vehicle had been abandoned at the scene. She took a taxi to the impound lot. She paid the fee, $140, without comment. She signed the release form. She drove home. She sat at her kitchen table with a spiral notebook open and wrote down every detail she could reconstruct from the night before. Times, words, sequence, the exact language she had used, and the exact language Calloway had used in response. She wrote the dispatch confirmation number from memory, CF 2401-0178, because she had heard the dispatcher say it through the open window before Calloway shut off his radio. She noted the tow fee and the impound lot address and the name of the person who had processed her release, whose ID badge she had read carefully at the window. Then she put the notebook down, made a second cup of coffee, and opened her laptop. She was not in a hurry. The people who tend to get what they are owed in situations like this are rarely the ones who move in the first heat of it. They are the ones who can sit at a kitchen table the morning after and finish breakfast before they do anything else. She ate breakfast. The formal complaint was filed at 9:45 a.m., 2 days after the stop. Simone walked into the Carver Falls Police Department's public service window carrying a manila folder, printed complaint form completed in full, the narrative attachment typed and double-spaced, copies of the impound receipt, a printout of the dispatch call log showing the confirmed registration, and a one-page summary of the relevant sections of OCGA, Section 17-5-30, printed from the official Georgia General Assembly website with the URL visible at the bottom of each page. The officer at the desk took the folder and looked at it the way people look at things they have not decided how to categorize yet. Captain Fern Okafor was notified within the hour. She was 51 years old, 23 years on the department, and she had handled complaints before. The ones that generated paper, the ones that found lawyers, the ones that went quiet after a month. She had a system for determining, fairly quickly, which kind each one was. She looked at the name on the complaint. She looked at the address. She called Calloway into her office and asked him what had happened. He told her. He used the word combative twice. He said the woman had refused to answer basic questions, had cited legal statutes in a way that felt aggressive, had not complied with his instructions in a timely manner. He said he had documented everything by the book. Okafor nodded. She told him to write a supplemental incident report and have it on her desk by end of watch. She told him she would handle the complaint administratively. Then she called Simone's number from the contact information on the form. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Okafor used the word misunderstanding twice. She said the officer in question had followed proper procedure for a standard vehicle stop. She said complaints of this nature were reviewed internally and that Simone would receive a written response within 30 days. She said the department took all concerns seriously. Simone said, "I'd like to confirm that this call is being conducted with my formal complaint on file." Okafor said it was. Simone said she would wait for the written response. That was all. 4 minutes. Both women knew exactly where the edges of the exchange were, and neither moved past them. Sergeant Jasper Holt had been on shift the same night as Calloway. He had not been present at the stop, but he arrived at the impound lot at 12:40 a.m. while Calloway was completing his paperwork, and the two men stood in the cold for 20 minutes, speaking in the particular quiet way that colleagues speak when they are comparing what they remember against what would be useful to have remembered. Holt was careful. He was always careful. He had 17 years on the department, 10 more than Calloway, and he had survived that long by understanding that the reports were not just documentation, they were architecture. You built them deliberately, or someone else built their case around your gaps. By the time Holt sat down to write the supplemental report the following afternoon, the one Okafor had requested, the one that would become the department's official account of the incident, it was thorough, carefully worded, and entirely plausible. He did not lie in it precisely. He used language with just enough elasticity to accommodate the facts as they existed, while arranging them in a sequence that told a particular story. Subject initially declined to comply with requests was accurate if you understood the word comply to include asking whether a search was legally required. Officer observed signs of agitation in subject's demeanor was the kind of phrase that is very difficult to disprove because agitation is in the eye of the beholder, and Holt had 17 years of beholding to draw on. He added one phrase near the end of the supplemental that he was particularly satisfied with. Subject demonstrated unusual familiarity with legal terminology, consistent with a pattern of predatory complaint filing. It was not in any policy document, it cited no precedent, but it would read, to someone skimming, as authoritative, as though there were such a pattern and as though Simone fit it. Calloway read the report before it was filed and thought it was exactly right. The City Council of Carver Falls met every second and fourth Wednesday of the month. Alderman Boyce Prater had held his seat for 11 years, which in a town of 34,000 is long enough to become furniture. He was 64 years old, comfortably built, with the kind of face that reads as reasonable in photographs and slightly less so in person. He had a working relationship with the police department that he described publicly as collaborative oversight and that functioned in practice as mutual non-interference. The department did not investigate contractors with council connections. The council did not reduce the department's operational budget. Both parties found this arrangement functional and had for a decade. Prater heard about Simone Graves's complaint through Okafor, who called him 4 days after it was filed, not because this was standard procedure, it was not, but because they had a way of keeping each other informed about things that might require management before they became inconvenient. Okafor described the complaint. She described the filer. She mentioned that the woman had been unusually prepared and had cited statutes during the stop itself, which she framed as combative rather than informed. Prater listened without interrupting. He thanked her. He filed the name. He did not act immediately. He was patient in the way that people are patient when they have 11 years of practice and a reliable system. What happened next did not look like retaliation. That was the point. It looked like a budget reallocation. The consulting arrangement Simone held with the city's Community Services Division, 50 hours over 6 months, reviewing accessibility documentation for public buildings, was canceled 11 days after the complaint was filed. The email arrived from a city administrator 2 tiers below Prater's position, citing budget reallocation effective immediately. It contained no other explanation. It did not reference the complaint. It did not reference her name beyond the salutation. Simone read the email at 8:23 a.m. on a Thursday. She looked at it for a moment, a beat longer than she might have looked at an unrelated message. Then she created a folder on her desktop labeled with that morning's date, moved the email into it, and noted the timestamp in her spiral notebook. She did not reply to the email. There was nothing in the email to reply to. A budget reallocation was a budget reallocation. On paper. She was not surprised. She had not been surprised since she was 19 years old and first understood that systems do not need to be overtly hostile to be effective. They just need to be consistent and patient and plausibly deniable. The machinery of discouragement rarely announces itself. It arrives as paperwork. She filed the folder. She made a note. She moved on to the next thing. The fourth Wednesday of January, Boyce Prater stood at the council podium during the open session public safety segment and read aloud from Holt's supplemental incident report. He did not say where the document had come from. He read selectively. The phrases about non-compliance, the phrase about signs of agitation, the phrase unusual familiarity with legal terminology that Holt had crafted with the specific intention of making ordinary civic knowledge sound like something suspicious. Prater did not use Simone's name. He referred to her as the individual in question and described the incident as an example of what happens when complaints are filed in bad faith to harass officers doing difficult work under difficult conditions. He said it with the comfortable authority of a man reading from a document, which gave everything he said the weight of paper, even when the paper was not his to share. The gallery was small that Wednesday evening, perhaps 20 people, mostly retirees and 2 local business owners who attended out of habit. A few in the audience nodded at Prater's framing. One man in a brown jacket near the back row looked uncertain, as though something in the phrasing had caught on something in his thinking, but he could not quite pull it free. A woman near the aisle was writing in a small notebook with a methodical, unhurried motion. That was Hazel Wren, who covered the county beat for the Carver Falls Recorder and attended every council session as a professional discipline, even the boring ones, especially the ones that turned out not to be boring. Holt was in the gallery's second row. He did not speak. He listened to Prater read from the report he had written. When the phrase emotionally unstable responses landed, the phrase he had crafted carefully, keeping it attributable to observation rather than formal diagnosis, his expression did not change. But something in him settled slightly, the way a mechanism settles when it engages correctly. Simone was not in the gallery that evening. She was at home, listening to a recording. She had attended the previous session 2 weeks earlier and placed her phone on the edge of the public seating armrest in a way that captured audio clearly. It was a public meeting. Recording public meetings in Georgia is legal under OCGA Section 50-18-70. She had done nothing covert. She had simply done it without announcing it, which is a different thing entirely. She listened to the January recording twice. She wrote down every phrase Prater had attributed to the report. She cross-referenced them against the actual text of Holt's supplemental, which she had obtained through a separate records request. 3 of the phrases Prater read aloud had been slightly altered from the original, not so much that anyone would notice without the 2 documents side by side, but enough that the alterations had a direction. Each one made Simone sound a degree more erratic than Holt's already calibrated language had suggested. She noted this in the spiral notebook with the page numbers from both documents. Then she put the pen down and made dinner. The move from institutional pressure to something more personal came on a Wednesday afternoon in early February. Simone had been at the City Hall Public Document Request Office filing a FOIA request for the original dispatch log from the night of the stop. She had parked in the municipal lot behind the building and returned to her car at 4:57 p.m. when the lot was largely empty, the sky already dimming toward the particular gray that February afternoons in central Georgia carry for weeks without variation. A man was leaning against a sedan 2 spaces from hers, not in uniform, dark jacket, dark pants, the build of someone who maintains it deliberately. She recognized him without effort, the way you recognize a specific type of problem by its shape before you can fully name it. Drew Calloway, off-duty, watched her cross the parking lot without moving. He let her get close enough that he would not need to raise his voice. "You should stop while you're ahead." Not a threat, technically, not a command, a suggestion delivered in the register of someone who has said this kind of thing before and watched it work. The slow erosion of confidence that comes when a person in authority tells you quietly that you are heading somewhere you do not want to go. Simone stopped. She looked at him. She said nothing. Calloway held her gaze. "People around here understand how things work. You might want to think about that." A pause. He was waiting for something, a flinch, a word, some sign that the message had landed where he intended it to land. She turned to her car, unlocked it, placed her bag on the passenger seat, and got in. She closed the door. She put the key in the ignition. She sat there for a count of 10, not because she was rattled, but because she wanted her hands fully steady before she drove, and also because the recording application in her coat pocket started on the steps of City Hall when she exited the building, because she had made a practice of starting it on any public ground connected to this matter, was still running, and she wanted the ambient audio to capture the silence that followed his words before she started the engine. She drove home at the posted speed limit. She pulled into her driveway. She sat in the car for another moment. Then she transferred the audio file to her laptop, named it with the date, the time, and the location, and moved it to a folder that was now, between the original stop recording, the council session recording, and this one, beginning to have considerable weight. She did not know yet exactly what form the weight would take. She knew she was building something that would eventually need to hold under pressure, and that every piece added to it now was a piece that would be verified later by someone who would want to know the chain of custody was clean from the beginning. She made that entry in the spiral notebook, turned off the kitchen light, and went upstairs. 3 weeks after the FOIA request was filed, the dispatch log arrived. 8 pages, PDF format, cross-referenced with the incident report number. Simone printed it, sat at her kitchen table, and read it with the same attention she gave everything in this folder that mattered. Then she read it again. The dispatch log showed the timestamp of the radio confirmation, the moment when dispatch told Calloway the vehicle registration was valid and clean at 11:44 p.m. Calloway's incident report stated that he had run the plate and received confirmation at 11:47 p.m. 3 minutes. A gap that would mean nothing in isolation. It was only significant in sequence. If the log was correct, Calloway knew the car was clean before he demanded she step out of the vehicle, before the escalation, before the cuffs. If the incident report was correct, he had not yet received confirmation when he made those decisions. 3 minutes, and one of those documents was wrong. Simone wrote the discrepancy in her notebook in capital letters, with the page number from each source noted on either side. Then she filed a second FOIA request, this one for the dispatch log's metadata, the digital record of when the file was created, when it was last accessed, and whether it had been modified after initial entry. She did not know yet about Crystal Wade. She would not know about Crystal Wade for several more weeks, But the document would tell her what she needed, in time, because documents always do when you know how to read them and have the patience to wait for the full set. Hazel Wren had been covering the county beat for the Recorder for 6 years. She was 38, methodical, and had a professional philosophy she articulated once to a younger reporter at the paper as, "I don't write what I think. I write what I can prove, and then I wait until I have more than I need before I file." It was not a glamorous philosophy. It was the reason she was still employed and the reason the stories she did file tended to hold. She had filed a parallel FOIA request for the same dispatch log 2 days after Simone, independently, because she had attended the council session where Prater read from Holt's supplemental report. The thing that caught her attention was the path of the document. An internal police supplemental report should not be traveling to the council chambers through informal channels, and the way Prater handled it suggested he had been given it specifically, not stumbled across it through public records. That was a story about process. Process stories were less exciting than confrontation stories, but they were the ones that actually changed things. When her copy of the dispatch log arrived, she spread it on her desk next to her notes from the council session and the incident report number she had obtained through public court filings. She sat with the 3 documents for a while, moving between them, the way she moved between sources when she was looking for the point where their accounts diverged. She found it at 11:44 p.m. She wrote 3 minutes on a sticky note and pressed it to the corner of her monitor. Then she began drafting a records request for the metadata on the original dispatch log file. The same request Simone had already filed, the same question arriving from 2 directions at once. She did not publish anything. She was building, and she had learned to wait until the structure could support the weight of what she intended to put on top of it. A week later, she called the number she found on the public records request tracking sheet. Both their names appeared on the same county FOIA log, which was public, and left a message identifying herself and the paper and saying she had a question about a discrepancy in county dispatch records and would appreciate a brief conversation at Simone's convenience. She did not name the discrepancy. She did not need to. Simone called back within 2 hours. The conversation lasted 4 minutes and covered nothing specific. At the end of it, both women understood exactly what the other had found, without having said so in language that would constitute anything committal. Hazel wrote 3 words at the bottom of her notepad: independent, same gap. Then she circled them. Meanwhile, Crystal Wade was not sleeping well. She was 31 years old, had been a civilian dispatcher with the Carver Falls Police Department for 4 years, and had never in those 4 years done anything she considered seriously wrong. She had always filed her logs on time. She had never tampered with anything. She was careful, professional, good at the job in the quiet way that people who are genuinely suited to their work tend to be good at it. What she had done on a Tuesday afternoon 12 days after Simone filed her FOIA request had taken approximately 40 seconds. The dispatch log management system allowed supervisory-level edits for corrections, misspellings, transposed call numbers, data entry errors. Crystal had supervisor access, which she had been granted for legitimate operational reasons. She had opened the log from the night of the stop. She had adjusted the timestamp on the radio confirmation from 11:44 p.m. to 11:47 p.m. She had saved the file. Holt had asked her to, which was the part she kept turning over. Not ordered, asked. There was a difference in how it felt, or there had been in the moment. He had framed it as a correction, said the original entry had been a transcription error, that the actual confirmation had come 3 minutes later than logged, and that the discrepancy could create confusion if the file went through discovery. He had said us, the way he sometimes said us when he meant the department broadly, meaning the people she worked with every day, meaning the institutional body she was part of. She had understood, somewhere that was not quite conscious, that this was not a routine correction. She had done it anyway. The FOIA request arrived in her inbox the following morning. She read it twice. She read the second name on the parallel request, Hazel Wren, the recorder, and that name she recognized because she had seen Hazel Wren's byline on every significant county story in the past 3 years. She sat at her workstation for the rest of that shift without making an error and without speaking more than necessary. That evening, she called Holt. She told him about the dual requests. He told her to say nothing, do nothing, and act normal. He said it the way he said most things, evenly, without urgency, with the confidence of someone who has been in difficult situations before and found that most of them resolve themselves if you simply maintain your position. She said she understood. She hung up. She did not sleep well that night, nor the one after. The letter from the State Office of the Inspector General arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Simone had filed with them directly, bypassing the County Internal Affairs Unit entirely. The bypass had not been impulsive. Simone had called the county IA intake line and been told, in language that was technically accurate and strategically deployed, that because Callaway's department was municipal in structure, county-level IA lacked jurisdiction over the complaint. This was not entirely true. Jurisdiction in these situations is layered and contested, but the intake officer had said it with the particular flat confidence of someone reading from a script they have been handed for a purpose. And Simone had thanked him politely, driven home, and spent 2 hours with the state's peace officer conduct statutes. Under OCGA, Section 35-8-23, the Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council maintained oversight authority over officer conduct complaints that involve potential policy violations at the certified officer level. The state OIG, operating in a parallel track, had jurisdiction over complaints involving potential civil rights implications, where local review mechanisms had been found inadequate or conflicted. Simone had cited both provisions in her filing. She had attached the county IA intake officer's statement, documented in her notebook, and confirmed by a follow-up email she had sent to the intake line, asking for written confirmation of the jurisdictional ruling, as evidence that local review was unavailable. The letter from the OIG was a standard form confirmation. What made it slightly different from standard was that it was signed by hand. Ezra Tull, investigator, State Office of the Inspector General, Georgia Department of Public Safety, and addressed to Ms. Graves, not Dear Complainant, which was the language the form used when the response was automated. Someone had typed her name. She read the letter twice. She put it in the folder. The folder was now noticeably thicker than it had been 3 weeks before, and that thickness was the record of something being built, piece by piece, in the particular way that cases are built, when the person building them understands that every document will eventually need to stand up in a room full of people whose professional interest is finding reasons to dismiss it. She filed it. She made a note. 3 days later, Ezra Tull called. The call lasted 12 minutes. He asked questions in a particular order: the stop, the booking, the tow, the contract cancellation, the parking lot exchange, in the organized, sequenced manner of someone who has already read the file and is using a call to fill gaps rather than establish basics. He did not react to anything she said. He confirmed 2 dates and 1 document reference number. He asked whether she had retained all original recordings in unedited form and whether the chain of custody for each had been maintained without interruption. She said yes to both. He asked whether she would be available for a pre-hearing deposition scheduled for mid-March, and said the session would require approximately 2 hours, and that he would need everything she had, not summaries, the originals. She said she had everything. He said, "I suspected as much, Ms. Graves." He said it without particular emphasis, not warmly, not with the weight of someone trying to communicate something coded, just evenly, in the tone of a person who has assessed a situation and arrived at an opinion about it. She could not have said precisely what he meant by the suspected. She could say that something in the way he said her name, correctly, without the hesitation that people sometimes have when they are reading an unfamiliar name from a file, made her sit slightly straighter. After the call ended, she sat at her kitchen table for a moment. Outside, January was still holding on, a gray sky pressing low over the rooftops on Pemberton Road. She looked at the folder on the table. She looked at the hall closet across the room, its door shut. She did not open it. She stood, went upstairs, and stood in the dark of her bedroom for a minute before she reached for the lamp. She was tired in a specific way, not the tiredness of exhaustion, but the tiredness that comes from sustained attention over weeks, from holding a shape against constant pressure, from knowing that the work ahead was still considerable and that it would require the same quality of attention she had given to everything so far, without break. She set her phone on the nightstand. Her brother Isaac had called that afternoon while she was in the document request office, and she had not called him back. She looked at the missed call notification. She would call him tomorrow. There was nothing wrong. She just did not have the particular kind of energy that conversations with people who love you require when the situation you are in is still unresolved. Because they ask how you are doing, and you have to decide how much of the answer to give them. And that decision costs something she was saving for other things right now. She turned off the lamp. She lay in the dark. She thought, methodically, about what she had. The recordings, the dispatch discrepancy, the metadata request, the contract cancellation email, the council meeting audio, the parking lot exchange, the OIG filing, and now the call from Ezra Tull. She thought about what she still needed, the metadata results, the full hearing procedure, and one more thing she had not yet brought out of the closet. Not yet, but soon. The spiral notebook was nearly full. She had started it in December, filling it with the patient, systematic attention of someone not documenting an experience, but constructing a record. The kind of record that could be cross-referenced, authenticated, and placed in front of a panel without apology. There were 2 pages left. On the second to last page, she drew a single horizontal line across the blank space. Below the line, she wrote tomorrow's date. Above the line, she left it blank. What was above the line was already documented elsewhere, in formats considerably harder to dismiss than handwriting in a notebook. She closed it. She set it on the bedside table. Somewhere across town, Crystal Wade lay awake, calculating whether the timestamp change was discoverable and deciding, again, that it probably was not. Holt had gone to sleep without difficulty. Calloway was at a bar 2 miles away, on his 3rd drink, telling the bartender about a difficult complainant who would eventually understand how things worked in this town. Prater was at dinner, his phone face down on the table, which was how he kept the boundary between council work and personal time, and which felt to him like discipline. And in the county record system, 2 pending FOIA requests, both for the same dispatch log metadata, filed 7 days apart by 2 different requesters, were moving through the queue toward the same answer. 3 minutes. On paper, nothing. In sequence, everything. The date Simone wrote below the line was the date of her deposition with Ezra Tull. It was 14 days away. She was ready now. She had been ready in most of the ways that mattered for some time. What was coming was not a surprise to her. What was coming was a room, and documents, and people who had made decisions they believed were safely buried, and a record she had been building since December with the specific intention of bringing it into exactly that room. The hall closet door was still closed. It would stay closed a few more weeks. What Simone had built over the 7 weeks since the stop was a kind of parallel record, not a counter-narrative exactly, but a documentation of the same events from a vantage point that differed from the official account in every detail that mattered. Calloway had his supplemental. Holt had his supplemental. The department had its internal files, and Simone had her folder, her recordings, her notebook, and the patience of someone who has spent years understanding that the gap between what happened And what the official record says happened is where accountability either lives or dies. She had not filed a civil lawsuit. She had considered it and set it aside, at least for now. A civil action under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, the federal civil rights statute covering deprivation of rights under color of law, was available to her, but it was also a move that required timing. Filing too early meant filing before the administrative record was complete, which gave the opposing attorneys grounds to argue the complaint was premature and opened the door to procedural delays that could stretch the matter across years. The administrative track, the OIG complaint, the potential disciplinary hearing, needed to run first, or at least concurrently, with the documentary record fully assembled. She knew this because she had done her research. She did not know it the way a specialist knows something, the way you know something that lives in your professional vocabulary. She knew it the way someone knows something they have studied carefully from the outside. From statutes and case summaries and procedural guides, learning the architecture of a system for the specific purpose of navigating it without a guide. Or so it appeared. That appearance was, by this point in the story, doing a considerable amount of work. 2 weeks before the deposition with Ezra Tull, the dispatch log metadata arrived in response to her second FOIA request. It came as a single PDF, 6 pages, dense with system data in a format that required some time to parse. The metadata showed the original log entry timestamp, 11:44 p.m., and then below it, a modification entry. The file had been accessed and edited on a Tuesday afternoon, 12 days after the initial FOIA request was filed. The modification had been made from a workstation registered to the dispatcher station bank at the Carver Falls Police Department. The user ID attached to the modification session had been partially redacted in accordance with the county's standard privacy policy for internal personnel records. Partially. The last 4 digits of the user ID were visible, 7734. Simone noted them in her notebook. She filed the document. She did not yet know whose user ID 7734 was, but she knew it was a real number attached to a real person in the county personnel system. And she knew that a FOIA request for the dispatcher personnel records, filtered by the last 4 digits of assigned system IDs, was something she was entitled to file. She filed it that afternoon. While she was waiting for that response, she made a call she had been holding until she had enough to justify it. She called the state OIG's general inquiry line and asked whether, in the context of an ongoing complaint, she could provide supplemental documentation, and whether that supplemental documentation could include digital files in addition to the printed materials she had already submitted. She was told yes, and given a secure upload portal with her case number. She uploaded the metadata file. She uploaded the 3 recordings. She uploaded the contract cancellation email with its original digital headers intact. She uploaded the council session audio. She uploaded the parking lot exchange recording. Then she checked the uploads, confirmed they had processed, and closed the portal. She sat back. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, February had turned the corner toward a thin, unconvincing warmth, and the light in the afternoon was starting to last slightly longer than it had. She noticed this in the abstract way you notice small shifts in the natural world when your attention is mostly elsewhere. She looked at the spiral notebook. She picked up her pen. She wrote, "Supplemental uploaded. Case file complete as of today. Deposition in 11 days." She underlined "complete" once. She put the pen down. The day before the deposition, Simone received a call from her brother Isaac, calling from Memphis where he had lived for 6 years. She had been putting off calling him back for 3 weeks, not from avoidance exactly, but from the particular economy of energy that the sustained attention of the past months had required. Talking to Isaac was different from talking to anyone else in her life, in that he knew enough about her to ask the right questions. And the right questions right now would require answers she was not certain she could give without using words she had been deliberately avoiding. She picked up on the 3rd ring. They talked for 40 minutes. He asked how things were, which was how he always began, and she said things were proceeding, which was how she always answered when they were. He asked whether she was taking care of herself, and she said yes. And he accepted that the way you accept something from someone whose version of self-care looks different from your own, but has always proved adequate. He did not ask what specifically was proceeding. He knew enough to know she would tell him when she was ready, and he trusted her read of when that was, which was one of the reasons their relationship had survived adulthood intact. He told her about his work, about a project he was managing, about the cold in Memphis that had been worse than usual this year. She listened and asked a question about the project. He answered in detail. At the end, he said, "You sound like you're carrying something." She said, "I'll tell you about it when it's resolved." He said, "Okay, but call me after whatever happens." She said she would. She meant it. After she hung up, she sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, thinking about the word resolved. It was the word she had used, and it was accurate, and it was also slightly incomplete, because what she was hoping for was not resolution in the clean sense. The problem stated, the problem solved, the record corrected, the people responsible held to account in some definitive and satisfying way. That was not typically how these things worked. What she was hoping for was something more like partial correction, a formal finding, a record changed, consequences that fell, even if they fell unevenly and incompletely, on the people who had made the decisions that needed to be answered for. That was the realistic version. She had been living in the realistic version for a long time. She set the phone on the table. She looked at the folder, now so thick it would not lie flat. She looked at the closet door. Tomorrow, not today. She went to the closet. She stood in front of it for a long moment with her hand on the door handle, not opening it yet, just marking the moment before. Then she opened it. She reached past the winter coats to the shelf behind them, where a garment bag hung on a separate hook, zipped closed, waiting with the patience of something that has been waiting for months and is not in any particular hurry. She did not unzip it. She stood there for a count of 5. She looked at the shape of it through the dark fabric of the bag. She put her hand on the zipper pull. Then she let it go. Not yet. Tomorrow she was a witness. Tomorrow she was a complainant presenting documentation to an investigator who had already read the file and was conducting a pre-hearing session to establish the formal record. That was tomorrow's role, and it required a specific quality of attention and nothing else. The garment bag would stay zipped until the role changed. She closed the closet door. She turned off the kitchen light. She went upstairs. The folder sat on the table, too thick to lie flat, containing everything that had been built since December. Every record, every receipt, every timestamp, every word that had been said on a cold road at 11:52 p.m. in January, preserved in the flat, unforgiving accuracy of a recording that did not care about rank or reputation or institutional backing. 11 days from now, then 10, then 9, and soon enough the number would be 0. Ezra Tull would sit across from her with his notepad and his case file, and she would place the originals on the table between them, and the room would begin to understand what it had been dealing with. Until then, the closet door stayed closed. The spiral notebook sat on the bedside table, its last page empty except for a date. Outside, Carver Falls was quiet, the way it always was at this hour. Lights off on the residential streets, the municipal lot behind City Hall dark and empty, the police department on reduced overnight staff. 3 miles away, Crystal Wade had finally fallen into a shallow, uneasy sleep. Holt had been asleep for hours, untroubled in the specific way that people with his kind of confidence tend to sleep when they believe their architecture is solid. They were not wrong that it was solid. They were wrong about what it was up against. Tomorrow was the deposition. Simone Graves was ready. The deposition room at the state office of the Inspector General's Regional Satellite Office occupied a corner of a building that also housed a driver licensing branch and a state tax compliance unit. It was not an impressive room. Drop ceiling, a table with 6 chairs, a single window with a view of a parking structure. Ezra Toll was already there when Simone arrived, at 8:53 a.m., 7 minutes before the scheduled time. He stood when she entered, which was not required, and indicated the chair across the table from his with a small, neutral gesture. He was in his mid-50s, lean, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and the careful posture of someone who has spent many years in rooms like this one and has learned not to give the room anything unnecessary. His notepad was open. His pen was already in his hand. He had a printed copy of her complaint on the table in front of him, flagged at intervals with small adhesive tabs in 3 colors. Simone set her folder on the table. She sat down. "Miss Graves," he said, "thank you for coming in. Before we begin, I want to confirm for the record that this session is being recorded with your prior written consent, and that you may have an attorney present if you choose. You waive that right in writing. Is that still your preference?" "It is." He looked at her for a moment, not assessingly, not with any visible calculation, more the way a person looks at something they have already measured and are now simply confirming the measurement. Then he opened the first flag and began. They worked through the folder in sequence. He asked about each document, how it was obtained, when, whether the original was intact and unmodified, who had handled it between its creation and this table. He asked about the recordings in the same order, and she answered in the same register. Specific, reference to timestamps, without elaboration beyond what the question required. When they reached the metadata file, the dispatch log modification record with the partial user ID, he set his pen down for the first time. He looked at the document. He looked at the last 4 digits, 7734. He wrote something in his notepad that she could not read from across the table, then put his pen back in his hand. "The FOIA request for the dispatcher personnel records," he said. "Has it been fulfilled?" "I received it 4 days ago." She produced the document from the folder. User ID ending in 7734 corresponds to a workstation and login credential assigned to Crystal Wade, civilian dispatcher, badge number CFD19. He took the document. He read it. He clipped it to the metadata file with a small binder clip he produced from his jacket pocket, the way a person produces something they knew they would need. "The 3-minute discrepancy," he said. "You believe the original timestamp is accurate and the modification was intentional." "I believe the metadata supports that conclusion. I'm not in a position to determine intent. That's what this process is for." He looked at her again in that same measuring way. Then he wrote something else in his notepad. The deposition lasted 2 hours and 18 minutes. At the end of it, Ezra gathered his materials, made a neat stack of the documents she had provided, and stood. He told her that the pre-hearing investigation phase would require approximately 3 to 4 additional weeks, during which his office would be conducting independent interviews, and that she would be notified of the formal hearing date by certified mail with a minimum of 14 days' notice. He picked up his folder. Then he paused and said something that was not part of the procedural closing language. "Ms. Graves, the documentation you provided is," he seemed to consider the next word, "complete." She said, "I know." He left. She sat in the empty room for a moment. Outside, the parking structure was gray and unremarkable in the March light. She looked at the table, which now held only her folder, slightly thinner than it had been because she had left originals with Ezra and retained only her copies. She picked it up. She left. The 3 weeks that followed were quiet in a way that felt like pressure rather than rest. Simone continued her mornings, coffee, radio, the walk around the block, but there was a suspended quality to the days, the particular kind of waiting that comes when you have done everything you can do, and the outcome is now in someone else's hands. She did not like this phase. She had never liked it. You learn to sit with it because there is no alternative. But sitting with it does not mean you find it comfortable. Hazel Wren published a brief item in the recorder. 7 paragraphs, careful, sourced to public records, noting that the county's dispatch log for a January traffic stop showed a discrepancy of several minutes between the original entry and a subsequent modification, and that the Office of the Inspector General had confirmed an open complaint related to the same incident. She did not name Simone. She did not name Calloway by name, only by badge number, which was public record. She noted the FOIA request tracking numbers for anyone who wanted to pull the documents themselves. The item ran on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Calloway had called Holt 3 times. Holt answered once and told him to stop calling. Holt called the department's union representative, a man named Gerald Foss, who operated out of a small office in the county seat and represented officers in administrative proceedings, and described the situation. Foss told him to say nothing to anyone, forward all communications to Foss's office, and wait. Captain Okafor read the item in the recorder during her lunch break. She read it twice. She put the paper face down on her desk and kept it there for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, she called Alderman Prater. He did not answer. She left no message. Crystal Wade read the item on her phone during her shift and then sat at her dispatcher workstation for 4 hours, making herself perform the routine functions of the job with the mechanical accuracy of someone who is using precision as a way to avoid thinking. She had been doing that for weeks. She was very good at it by now. It was not sustainable, but it was all she had. Simone received the certified letter from the OIG on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after the deposition. The hearing was scheduled for May 9th, 6 weeks out. The location was a county conference facility, a neutral site rather than the police department's building, which was standard for disciplinary proceedings involving the department itself. The hearing panel would consist of an OIG investigator, a county human resources director from an adjacent county, and an independent civilian monitor with no administrative connection to Carver Falls or its police department. She read the letter once. She put it on the table. She went to the closet. This time she opened it. The garment bag was where it had always been, zipped and waiting. She unzipped it. Inside, folded with the particular careful flatness of something that has been stored with intention, was her judicial robe. The robe she had not worn since December, when she had taken personal leave to manage a property matter in Carver Falls, where she had moved after her appointment to fill a vacant seat, not yet publicly announced, on the Georgia Court of Appeals. The appointment had been confirmed by the State Judicial Nominating Commission in November. The public announcement was scheduled for late May, after the term began, after the docket was assigned, after the procedural requirements were met in the order they needed to be met. She had not worn the robe in Carver Falls. She had not mentioned her appointment to anyone in Carver Falls, including her neighbor Harold Finch, who had signed for a package from the state court's administrative office without looking at the return address. She had not listed her title in any local registration. She had not corrected anyone who addressed her as Ms. rather than something else. She was a private citizen in a small town, and she had wanted, for a few months before her public life expanded again, to simply be that. Drew Calloway had decided otherwise on a January night on a county road. He had made that decision based on what he saw, which was a middle-aged black woman in an older sedan at midnight who knew her rights and was not afraid to say so. She held the robe for a moment. She was not sentimental about it in the ordinary way. It was fabric, and what it represented was work, and the work was what mattered. But she understood, standing in the hall of her house on Pemberton Road, what it would mean to bring it into the room in 6 weeks. Not as performance, as documentation, as the final piece of a record that had been building since December. She zipped the bag back up. Not yet. 6 weeks. She went back to the kitchen table and started a new notebook. In the weeks between the letter and the hearing, Ezra Tull's office conducted its independent investigation quietly and without visible drama, which was how these things were supposed to work. He interviewed Calloway, who attended with Gerald Foss, and answered questions in the careful, monosyllabic register that Foss had almost certainly instructed, and Holt, who was more articulate and more careful, and Captain Okafor, who maintained that the department had followed all applicable procedures and that the complaint represented a mischaracterization of a routine stop. He interviewed Crystal Wade last. She came alone, which Ezra noted without comment. She had not been explicitly told she could bring someone, and she had not thought to ask. She sat across from him, and he asked her about the dispatch log modification, and she held the position she had been holding for months, that she had made a routine correction to a data entry error, that she had been authorized to do so, that the authorization had been verbal and informal, and she had not documented it separately. Ezra asked her who had provided the verbal authorization. She gave the name. He wrote it down. He asked whether she had documentation of any kind, an email, a text, a notation, confirming that the original entry was indeed an error. She said she did not. He thanked her and ended the interview. She left the building and sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before she drove away. She had not lied exactly. She had described the shape of events accurately. What she had omitted was the interior of the moment. The understanding she had had, sitting at her workstation that Tuesday afternoon, that what she was being asked to do was not a routine correction. The understanding she had set aside because Holt had said us, and she had wanted, badly, to still be part of that. She drove home. The thing about omissions is that they have weight, whether or not anyone else can see them. The 9th of May fell on a Thursday. The county conference facility was a functional building on the east edge of town. Beige carpet, drop ceiling, the kind of space that hosted budget meetings and retirement parties, and occasionally administrative hearings that had the potential to become something more significant than their surroundings suggested. The hearing room had been arranged with a panel table at the front, 3 chairs for the panel, and 2 tables facing it, one for the complainant and one for the respondents. Calloway and Holt sat at the respondents' table with Gerald Foss between them. Foss had a leather portfolio open in front of him and the practiced stillness of someone who has been in rooms like this many times. Calloway was in a press shirt and slacks, no uniform. Holt was similarly dressed, and he had the composed, slightly remote expression of someone who has decided that composure is the performance required and is executing it reliably. Captain Okafor sat in the gallery. Prater was not present. Hazel Wren was in the back row with her notebook, having confirmed with the facility coordinator the previous day that administrative hearings of this type were public proceedings under Georgia's open meetings framework. Simone arrived at 9:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the scheduled start time. She carried a flat leather document case, not her usual manila folder, and set it on the complainant's table without opening it. Ezra Tull and the 2 other panel members entered at 10 o'clock precisely. The panel chair, a woman named Dr. Abigail Frost, the Human Resources Director from Linden County, called the session to order. She confirmed the names of the parties, confirmed the recording setup, and stated the purpose of the proceeding. An administrative disciplinary hearing under OCGA Section 35-8-23 concerning complaints of officer misconduct filed against Drew Calloway, badge CF 441, and Jasper Holt, badge CF 229, of the Carver Falls Police Department, with supplemental matters regarding related departmental conduct. She said that the proceeding would follow a structured format, opening statements from each party, presentation of documentary evidence, testimony from named parties, and panel deliberation. She noted that the panel's findings would be issued in writing within 30 days and that they were not a criminal proceeding. Criminal referrals, if warranted, were a separate track handled by the appropriate prosecutorial authority. Foss made a brief opening statement. He described the stop as lawful and properly documented. He described the escalation as a response to the complainant's non-compliance. He described the complaint as, in his word, retaliatory, an attempt to use the administrative process to punish an officer for doing his job correctly. He was measured, professional, and entirely unconvincing to anyone who had read the full file, which he did not know all three panel members had done in detail before arriving. Simone made no opening statement. She said she preferred to let the documentation speak. Foss looked at her. Calloway looked at her. Holt, to his credit, kept looking at the panel. The documentation took 90 minutes to present. Ezra worked through it methodically, in the order established by the complaint filing and supplemented by the materials Simone had provided at the deposition. He began with the dispatch recording. Dispatch ID CF 2401-0178, logged 11:39 p.m., January 14th, and played the relevant segment through a speaker on the panel table. The room heard Calloway's voice confirm receipt of the plate information. It heard dispatch confirm, clearly and without ambiguity, that the vehicle was registered clean. It heard Calloway acknowledge. Then Ezra noted the timestamp, 11:44 p.m. He placed the incident report on the table, Calloway's original, then Holt's supplemental, and read the relevant section. The incident report stated that Calloway had received the confirmation at 11:47 p.m. He placed the dispatch log modification metadata next to it. He read the modification entry. He read the workstation number. He read the user ID ending in 7734. He placed the dispatcher personnel record next to that. He read the name, Crystal Wade, badge CFD19. He placed Crystal Wade's interview transcript on the table and read the relevant section. Her statement that she had made the modification at Sergeant Holt's verbal request without documentation of the authorization. Foss said, "Objection. The witness's statement is being characterized selectively." Dr. Frost said, "Overruled. The transcript is in evidence in full. Counsel may address the full transcript during cross-examination." Foss made a note. Calloway was very still. Holt had moved his gaze to a point approximately 18 inches above the panel table and appeared to be studying it with genuine interest. Ezra continued. He placed a recording from the night of the stop, the one from Simone's phone, started on Margaret Elford's front step, on the table. He read from the transcript his office had prepared, noting the timestamp, the case number, and the authentication chain. The file had been transferred to the OIG's secure server on March 14th, authenticated by the office's digital forensic specialist, Raymond Carr, whose certification was appended. He read the relevant section aloud. The room heard Simone's voice, measured and clear in the cold. "I am not resisting. My name is Simone Graves. The time is 11:52 p.m. I am being handcuffed without stated cause." And then, "I'd like to document the procedure being used here." He placed the parking lot recording on the table. He read the authentication chain and then read the transcript. The room heard Calloway's off-duty voice, close and quiet. "You should stop while you're ahead. People around here understand how things work. You might want to think about that." Foss said, "I'd like to note for the record that my client was off-duty at the time of that alleged statement, and that there is no evidence of..." Dr. Frost said, "The note is in the record, counsel. You'll have the opportunity to address it." She looked at Ezra. He continued. He placed the contract cancellation email on the table, the one from the city administrator, received 11 days after the complaint was filed. He noted the email header data, which showed the message had been drafted at 4:22 p.m., 11 minutes after an internal city email chain, obtained through a separate FOIA request, showed Alderman Prater forwarding a note to two city administrators with the subject line, "Consulting arrangements, review priority." Prater's email had been obtained legally. It showed the subject line and the recipient addresses. The body of Prater's email was present in the production, but the text of two sentences in the middle of the message had been redacted by the city clerk's office, under a personnel exemption that Ezra's office had already flagged as potentially improper and was reviewing separately. He noted both the content that was visible and the content that was not, for the record. Then he set down the last document. It was a sealed envelope, which he opened with a letter opener he produced from his portfolio. He removed a single-page document and placed it face up on the table. He looked at Simone. She nodded once. He read, "The following biographical information has been provided pursuant to the complaint resolution process and with the consent of the complainant." He paused, not for effect, because the next sentence required the room to be paying attention. "The complainant in this matter, Simone A. Graves, holds the following appointments and credentials." Another pause. Associate Justice Designate, Georgia Court of Appeals, 9th District. Appointment confirmed November 14th of last year by the Georgia Judicial Nominating Commission. Public announcement pending formal term commencement. Prior service, 12 years, Superior Court of Fulton County, Civil and Criminal Divisions. Appellate practice, 14 years, with docketed matters including 17 civil rights cases before state and federal courts. He set the paper down. The room was quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness, the quiet of a room in which a significant number of people have just been required to revise something they thought they understood. Calloway's hands, which had been flat on the table in front of him, moved slightly. He turned to look at Holt. Holt was still looking at the point 18 inches above the panel table. His jaw had tightened in a way that was visible from across the room, but he did not move. Gerald Foss did not say anything. He looked at his leather portfolio. He turned to a blank page and wrote something at the top, and then stopped writing. He looked like a man who had come to a hearing with a strategy and had just watched it become inapplicable. Okafor, in the gallery, had her hands clasped in her lap and her eyes directed at the floor in front of her. She had known about the complaint for months. She had dismissed it in 4 minutes on a phone call. She had used the word misunderstanding. Hazel Wren wrote something in her notebook and then drew a line under it, pressing hard enough that the line was visible from several seats away. Dr. Frost let the silence hold for a moment. Then she said, "We'll take a brief recess before proceeding to examination of witnesses." She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The recess lasted 12 minutes. When the panel reconvened, Foss requested a continuance to allow additional preparation time in light of the new information. Dr. Frost denied the request. She said the information had been part of the OIG's file and available to all parties under standard pre-hearing disclosure procedures, and that counsel had been provided the full file 14 days prior to the hearing date. Foss did not argue. There was nothing useful to argue. The witness examination lasted 2 hours. Calloway's account that the stop had been based on a general observation of vehicle behavior, that the escalation had been a response to non-compliance, that he had not known the dispatch confirmation had already come through, did not survive contact with the recording and the dispatch timestamp in any version that could be described as convincing. He was not a bad witness in the technical sense. He answered questions without obvious evasion. But the story he told required the documents to say things they did not say, and no amount of careful phrasing changed what the documents said. Holt's examination was more interesting and ultimately more damaging. He was precise and composed, and his precision revealed, under questioning, the degree of craft that had gone into the supplemental report. Ezra walked him through the language, phrase by phrase. Each phrase that had been drafted with elasticity became, under examination, an illustration of the gap between what was documented and what had occurred, not because Holt confessed to anything, but because explaining his word choices required him to acknowledge choices had been made, and the choices had been made in a particular direction. The phrase, predatory complaint filing, received particular attention. Ezra asked where the phrase came from, whether it appeared in any departmental policy or training document, and what criteria Holt had used to apply it to this complainant. Holt said it reflected his professional assessment. Ezra asked whether the assessment had been formed before or after he learned about the FOIA request. Holt said before. Ezra placed the timeline on the table. The FOIA request had been filed before the supplemental report was written. Foss objected twice. Both objections were overruled. The panel deliberated privately for 4 days. The written findings were issued on May 13th and delivered by certified mail to all parties. The findings were 16 pages long. Ezra read from them over the phone with Simone 2 hours after she received her copy. Not because she needed him to, but because he had called and offered, and she had said yes. And there was something useful in hearing the language read aloud by someone who had built the case, rather than reading it in the silence of her own kitchen. The panel found that Officer Drew Calloway had conducted a pretextual vehicle stop without articulable, reasonable suspicion of any traffic violation, in a manner inconsistent with OCGA Section 17-5-30 and contrary to Carver Falls Police Department Operational Policy Section 4-11. The panel found that the escalation to physical detention lacked the evidentiary basis required by department policy. The panel found that Calloway's off-duty contact with the complainant in the municipal parking lot constituted conduct unbecoming an officer and a violation of OCGA Section 35-8-23, subsection B, paragraph 3. Calloway was suspended without pay pending conclusion of a supplemental criminal review by the County District Attorney's Office, which the panel had recommended under the standard referral process for findings implicating potential violations of 18 U.S.C. Section 242, criminal deprivation of rights under color of law. The referral did not guarantee prosecution. The district attorney would make that determination independently. The timeline for the DA's review, 60 to 90 days to complete, with any charging decision potentially months beyond that. The panel found that Sergeant Jasper Holt had prepared a supplemental report using language specifically crafted to mischaracterize the complainant's conduct, and that this mischaracterization was material to the complaint review process in a way that constituted a violation of department documentation standards and potentially the state's obstruction statutes. Holt was placed on administrative leave pending a separate disciplinary proceeding focused on report falsification. The union had filed a grievance on his behalf within 24 hours of the findings being issued. Crystal Wade's employment status was under review by the city's HR department. The findings noted that her modification of the dispatch log, made at the verbal direction of a superior officer without independent verification, constituted a failure of professional judgment, regardless of intent, and recommended mandatory remediation and a formal review of access permissions for the dispatch log management system. The findings carefully noted that the question of criminal intent remained unresolved and was subject to the DA's independent review. As to Alderman Prater, the panel's jurisdiction did not extend to elected officials. What the findings did include was a footnote, 3 sentences, noting that the contract cancellation email and the internal correspondence header referencing Prater's name had been forwarded to the Georgia Government Transparency and Campaign Finance Commission for independent review. The 2 redacted sentences in Prater's email remained unaddressed. The commission's review had its own timeline, its own procedures, and its own outcome that could not be predicted. Captain Okafor received a formal written reprimand placed in her personnel file with a requirement to complete a 12-hour course in complaint intake procedures through the Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council. The department as a whole was directed to conduct a review of all vehicle stop documentation over the prior 18-month period, cross-referenced against demographic data, with findings submitted to the OIG within 90 days. The Georgia Department of Justice Civil Rights Unit had been notified of the findings and had opened a preliminary pattern or practice inquiry into the Carver Falls Police Department's stop and search practices. A federal monitor would be assigned for an initial assessment period of 18 months. The letter from the DOJ did not promise anything beyond assessment. Simone listened to Ezra read through the findings without interrupting. When he finished, there was a brief silence. He said, "Are you satisfied with the outcome?" She thought about the word satisfied. She thought about Calloway in the parking lot, in the cold February dark, saying, "You should stop while you're ahead." She thought about the dispatch recording, the confirmation that the car was clean, the acknowledgement, the door opening anyway. She thought about Holt's careful phrase, predatory complaint filing, written with the specific intention of making a woman who knew her rights sound like a threat. She said, "It's a beginning." He said he thought that was the right way to characterize it. He said his office would remain the point of contact for any subsequent developments in the DA's review. He said the federal monitor appointment would be made within 60 days and that the department would be required to cooperate. She thanked him. He said it was his job. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table with the 16-page findings in front of her. The folder, which had sat on this table for months, was gone. The originals were in Ezra's file, and the copies were in a box in the closet next to the garment bag. The table felt different without the folder on it. Not empty, just clear. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in late June, Simone drove home from the courthouse on the same road where she had been stopped in January. Not deliberately, it was simply the most direct route, as it had always been. She was wearing ordinary clothes. The robe was in the garment bag in the back seat because she had worn it that day and had not yet had reason to take it to the dry cleaner. The road was the same road. She drove 62 miles per hour in a 65 zone, which was how she always drove, and the shoulder where Calloway had made her stand in the cold was empty, the way it had been empty every time she had driven it since January. She did not stop. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat as she passed that stretch of road. Isaac, calling from Memphis at his usual evening hour. She let it ring once, then picked it up through the car's speaker. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he said. "How was today?" Productive. She meant it. The docket had been manageable, the arguments well prepared, the law sufficiently complex to require actual attention. She had been back from leave for 3 weeks, and the work had reestablished itself as the constant and absorbing thing it always was. She was grateful for that, in the way you are grateful for the things that hold their shape when other things do not. "And the other thing?" he said. "Findings are final. The DA's office is reviewing." She paused. "Calloway is still suspended. Holt's hearing is scheduled for July." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Are you okay?" She thought about it, the way she thought about things she was going to answer honestly. Outside, the Georgia summer pressed against the windows of the car, green and close and indifferent to everything that had happened in January and May and all the months between. "I'm all right," she said. He accepted that. He knew the difference between all right and fine, and she appreciated that he never asked her to collapse the distance between them. They talked until she reached her driveway. She pulled in, turned off the engine, and they talked for another few minutes about his project in Memphis, about the heat, about something small and inconsequential that neither of them would remember tomorrow. The ordinary tissue of a conversation between two people who have known each other their whole lives. After she hung up, she sat in the car for a moment. The garment bag lay across the back seat, zipped. She would take it to the cleaner tomorrow. She would be in court Thursday. The docket was full, which meant the work was full, which was how she wanted it. She got out of the car. She went inside. On the kitchen table, in the spot where the folder had sat for months, there was now only a single item. The new spiral notebook, 3/4 empty, open to the current week's page, the entries sparse because the work of this particular chapter was largely done. She looked at it for a moment. She closed it. The story did not end cleanly, which is how these stories actually work. 2 lines in Prater's email remained redacted. The commission review still underway. The content of those two sentences, a gap in the record that no one had yet explained. 11 minutes of dashcam footage from the night of January 14th remained listed in the evidence log as file not located on server. The note had been there since March. No one had explained that either. Ezra's office had flagged both in the findings. The flags were in the record. Whether anyone would follow them to where they pointed was a question with a timeline measured in months or years rather than days. Holt's union had filed a grievance. The disciplinary proceeding was scheduled for July, but could be continued. The outcome of the DA's review of the criminal referral was unknown, and the realistic range of outcomes ran from charges filed to a finding of insufficient evidence, with the most probable result somewhere in the middle of that range, a decision that would take time and would disappoint someone regardless of which direction it went. The federal monitor would be assigned, assessments would be conducted, the department's stop and search data would be reviewed, whether the review would produce policy changes and whether those changes would be enforced, and whether enforcement would persist past the monitor's 18-month term were questions that could not be answered in May or June or even the following year. What had happened was this. A record existed that had not existed before. It was clean, it was complete, and it was in the permanent files of the state's OIG and the DOJ's Civil Rights Unit, and the findings of a formal administrative hearing that was now public record. The record said, in the careful and technical language of administrative findings, that Drew Calloway had stopped a woman on a road in January for no lawful reason, that Jasper Holt had built a paper wall around it, that Crystal Wade had moved a timestamp 3 minutes to keep the wall standing, and that the department's senior officer and an elected official had used the complaint process itself as a tool to punish the woman who had filed it. The record also said who that woman was, which was a thing that Calloway and Holt and Prater and Okafor had not known when they made their decisions. Though the record was careful to note in its findings that this fact was relevant to the severity of the conduct, but not to its wrongfulness. The stop had been wrong. The report had been wrong. The contract cancellation had been wrong. All of it had been wrong before the sealed envelope was open, and the opening of the envelope had changed the visible consequences, not the underlying fact. Simone understood this distinction clearly. She had understood it from the beginning. The point was never that she was a judge. The appointment had not yet been announced when the stop occurred, and she had been, on that road, exactly what she appeared to be, a private citizen with rights, in a car she owned, driving home from a neighbor's house. The point was that those rights existed and had always existed and did not require a title or a robe or a sealed envelope from the state court's administrative office to be real. The robe had mattered for different reasons. It had mattered because it changed the calculation for the people in the room who needed their calculations changed. It had closed a door that Foss might otherwise have left open. It had ensured that the findings were complete rather than partial, and that the referrals were made rather than deferred. That was what it had done. That was enough. On the last Thursday in June, a small item appeared in the Carver Falls Recorder, below the fold on the second page of the local news section. It confirmed that Simone A. Graves, formerly of Pemberton Road, had been publicly announced as Associate Justice Designate for the Georgia Court of Appeals, 9th District. The item was 4 sentences long. It noted her 12 years on the Fulton County Superior Court and her background in civil rights appellate practice. It did not mention the stop, or the hearing, or the findings. That story had run separately 2 weeks earlier and did not need to be told again. Hazel Wren had written both items. She had written them in the same register, factual, precise, without editorial weight, because that was how she wrote, and because the facts were sufficient. They did not require anything added to them. The day the announcement item ran, Simone's phone rang with a number she did not recognize. She looked at the screen. She did not answer. She let it ring through to voicemail. No message was left. She set the phone down on the table next to the spiral notebook. She picked up the notebook. She wrote the date at the top of a new page, drew a line across the middle, and put the pen down. Above the line, enough. Below the line, what comes next? She went to make coffee. Outside, in a county record system that was currently undergoing a mandated review, a dispatch log modification sat in a folder labeled Pending Investigation, alongside an evidence log entry that said 11 minutes of dashcam footage had not been located on the server and remained, for now, unaccounted for. That was the part that had not been resolved. That part was waiting. Simone Graves never raised her voice. She never lost her composure. She never announced who she was or demanded different treatment because of it. She simply documented what happened, preserved what was said, and trusted that a complete record, built carefully and without compromise, would eventually do what it was built to do. That is the lesson that stays with you. Rights are not protected by the people who already know you have them. They are protected by the record you build when the room does not know and does not care and assumes the outcome is already decided. The stop was wrong before the envelope was opened. The report was wrong before anyone knew her title. Every act of dismissal, every casual calculation that she could be discredited or outlasted, all of it was wrong from the beginning. The sealed document did not create her rights. It made it harder for certain people to pretend those rights had never existed. There are Simone Graveses in every county in this country who do not have a sealed envelope. Their record still matters. The process, slow, incomplete, imperfect, still matters. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And leave a comment. What do you think happened to those 11 missing minutes?